Good Wednesday, everyone. It's so good to see you, as usual. Parashat Toldot is Yitzchak and Rivka's one shot. Avram gets 3 action-packed parshiot, brimming with details and developments. Yaakov, as we will encounter, has 6 action-packed parshiot. The entire second half of the book of Bereshit is dedicated to him and his family. And Yitzchak gets a lowly 1 Parashat Toldot. Okay, only 1, so you got to make it really count. And as you read the story of Parashat Toldot, it's not exactly the exciting story you could hope for. There are no big wars, no miracles. It's a pretty pedestrian parsha. And as you study the storyline of Rivka and Yitzchak's life, the content of this week's Torah portion, we actually uncover that's not even their own original story. It's the sequel of sorts of the saga that Avraham and Sarah lived. Our parsha begins with Yitzchak and Rivka struggling in fertility, an experience very suggestive of the same challenges that Avraham and Sarah go through. They settle in the land, and guess what? There's a famine again, reminiscent of the same situation that Avraham and Sarah faced. And if context wasn't compelling enough to make this case, the Torah goes out of its way to explicitly retell this famine in the context of Avraham's experience. Vayhi ra'av ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. Milvad hara'av harishon asher haya bimei Avraham, just like the first famine that existed in the time of Avraham. Just like Avraham and Sarah, Rivka and Yitzchak traveled to new land, and in the new land, fearing for their lives, Yitzchak tells Rivka to tell people that she is his sister. Sounds pretty familiar, right? Avraham and Sarah pull this ruse not once, but twice. And even in the last story of Yitzchak's life in this parsha, where we read about the dispute between Yitzchak and local shepherds over land, water, and resources, it's quite evocative of the dispute between Avraham and Lot shepherds, which lead them to part ways. Famine, infertility, wife to sister switches, quarreling shepherds. Yitzchak and Rivka seem to trace out the same storyline as his parents. What's going on here? As one of the avot, as one of the pivotal pillars of our people, shouldn't Yitzchak bring some unique message, some unique ideal and mission to our budding nation? And I think the answer is that he certainly does. Avraham and Sarah were revolutionaries. They brought to the world an idea of radical monotheism, an idea that marries both a deep-seated religious and theological awareness with a profound ethical and social responsibility. Avraham and Sarah cared for the sick, cared for the stranger, welcomed travelers, prayed for the wicked, all stemming from the same source of responsibility that led them to publicly denounce idols, proclaim and follow the Almighty. And while Avraham and Sarah were revolutionaries, Yitzchak is tasked with a far more important mission. Yitzchak is charged with perpetuating Avraham and Sarah's values and legacy, converting their revolution into an institution. Yitzchak's raison d'etre was to ensure that Avraham's revolution was not just a flash in the pan, an isolated glimmer of clarity lost in the vast, dark veil of time, but the beginning of a storied tradition, a permanent revolution. Yitzchak lives his life tracing out his parents' trajectory so that the values and the story that they started will be perpetuated, institutionalized, and internalized for generations to come. They tell a joke in the context of leadership. What do you call a leader without any followers? Just a guy taking a walk in the park. Yitzchak struggles to ensure that Avraham and Sarah's values are continued and that a nation follows. And that role is not glamorous, not so exciting, doesn't grab many parshiot, but the definition of success is never about how many stories are written about you, or what your enrollment numbers are, or retweets, or likes. It is solely a matter of whether the vision, the revolution of Avraham and Sarah are continued. And that is Yitzchak's quiet work of his entire life, transitioning the revolution into an institution. It's a critical push and pull that we feel across our entire lives. There are moments where we're called upon to be Abraham, to blaze a new path, to challenge the status quo. And at the same time, there are moments we're called to channel Yitzchak, to work to preserve and to perpetuate what we have received, and what has been created. But I think there's another element to the Yitzchak sequel, something I've been reflecting on a lot this past week. At each point where Rivka and Yitzchak engage in the same steps as their parents, they manage to do things a bit better, a bit more successful than the previous generation. Yitzchak and Rivka avoid the angst and agita of marrying a second wife. Despite the sister-wife deception, they manage to broadcast that Rivka is indeed his wife and prevents her from being kidnapped. Despite the famine, they stay in the land of Israel. And despite the challenges with Avimelech, they manage to make agreements with the Plishtim so that the wells of Abraham are redug and restored. Yitzchak and Rivka not only internalize the mission and values of his parents, but they learn the lessons from their missteps. And they think about how they can improve, perfect, even the right responses at that first moment. We're all human, even Abraham and Sarah, and there's always room for improvement. And I think the question we are faced with, that I've been thinking a lot about, as we look down the prospect of unfortunately rising numbers and the new lockdown, how do we as people, as individuals and a community behave? How do we act? How do we reach out to support ourselves and one another better than we did before? That's not to say that the marvelous mitzvot and the inspiring chesed of March, April, May, all the way until today was not insufficient or was not valued or valuable. Chas v'shalom. It has been inspiring to see. But I think that if, God forbid, we continue to go down the path that it seems to see, or at least something similar, the question we are reminded by this week's Parsha is that while we institutionalize the chesed of the past few months, how can we be better? It's an honest question that I don't know the answer to, and I think it's food for thought for all of us. And I would welcome anyone's reflections, because I think it's an important question that we ask ourselves always, and perhaps in these moments, most importantly. So in conclusion, I guess Parashat Toldot, Yitzchak and Rivka's one chance is quite memorable. It reminds us of the sublime and sacred and often not thanked work, translating a revolution into an institution, the Dore Dorot, forever. And it pushes us to constantly quest, even in the presence of familiar terrain, to challenge ourselves, or at least to ask ourselves, how can we do better? How can we respond more lovingly, more supportingly, more successfully, and more perfectly? Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much, Rabbi.